Early life. Adolf Hitler was born on the 20th of April 1889 in Braunau am Inn, a small town on the border between Austria and Germany, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His family was neither wealthy nor powerful. His father, Alois Hitler, was a strict and temperamental customs officer, obsessed with discipline and control. His mother, Clara Polzel, was the opposite, gentle, affectionate, and deeply protective of her son. Between these two extremes, young Adolf grew up in a household where love and authority constantly collided. He feared his father but adored his mother. Psychologists later suggested that this emotional contrast shaped a deep psychological pattern in him, a craving for affection mixed with resentment toward authority. As a child, Hitler was a dreamer. He loved drawing, studying old buildings, and losing himself in stories of German history. But in school, the boy from Linz was known for being stubborn and rebellious. He excelled in creative subjects like art and history, but despised the structured logic of math and science. His grades worsened, and at 16, he dropped out without finishing high school. His father was furious. He had wanted his son to become a civil servant, but Adolf refused, insisting he was destined to be an artist or architect. When Alois died in 1903, Hitler was freed from his father's authority, yet also lost the figure who had dominated his world. Years later, many biographers noted that Hitler seemed to fill that void by becoming the very image of his father, authoritarian, rigid, and obsessed with control. As a teenager, Hitler's world revolved around art, books, and German nationalism. He read obsessively about Prussia's glory and the unification of Germany under Otto von Bismarck. In his imagination, Germany became the model of strength, unity, and destiny, everything that the multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire lacked. He began to see himself not as Austrian, but as a misplaced German, a proud outsider in the wrong nation. That idea, mixed with youthful pride and loneliness, became the seed of his later extreme nationalism. In 1907, with money from his mother, Hitler moved to Vienna, the cultural capital of Europe, determined to become a painter. He believed he was meant for greatness, and the entrance exam to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts would prove it. But reality struck hard. The admissions board rejected him, noting that his architectural sketches were promising, but his figure drawings were weak. Ironically, they advised him to study architecture, something he couldn't do without a high school diploma. Then, tragedy struck. His beloved mother, Clara, died of breast cancer at just 47. Her death shattered the 18-year-old Hitler. He later described it as the greatest pain I have ever felt. He cared for her until her final moments and organized her funeral with deep devotion. The family doctor, Eduard Bloch, was Jewish, and Hitler treated him with rare kindness and respect, a striking contradiction given the hatred he would later unleash. Years later, when Hitler held absolute power, he personally ordered that Dr. Bloch be protected, calling him a noble Jew. But even that small flicker of compassion couldn't stop what came next. His mother's death broke something inside him. Alone, rejected, and directionless, Hitler drifted through the streets of Vienna. Between 1908 and 1913, he lived in cheap hostels and men's dormitories, selling postcards and small paintings to survive. Vienna at the time was a city of political extremes, monarchists, socialists, and anti-Semites, all shouting for attention. In this atmosphere, Hitler began absorbing dangerous ideas. He devoured propaganda that blamed Jews for everything, for corrupting art, for controlling finance, for weakening nations. The frustrated young artist slowly turned his bitterness into ideology. His failure in art became proof, in his mind, that the world was conspiring against him. The dreamer, who once sketched cathedrals, now saw enemies everywhere. Historians like Ian Kershaw and Joachim Fest later described these years as the psychological laboratory of a dictator. Out of family conflict, personal loss, and humiliation grew a worldview built on resentment and revenge. The story of Hitler's youth is more than biography, it's a warning. It shows how unhealed emotional wounds can transform into destructive obsession. A child longing for love, raised under pressure and disappointment, can grow into an adult who seeks control instead of compassion. Had history gone differently, had Hitler been accepted into art school, he might have remained a mediocre painter in a small Viennese gallery. Instead, rejection became his defining moment, turning personal failure into the fuel for global catastrophe. Today, psychologists still study Hitler as an example of extreme narcissism, a personality driven by a fragile ego, an inflated sense of destiny, and a deep fear of humiliation. In popular culture, the image of Hitler the failed artist has become a symbol of how resentment can twist a man's fate, appearing in countless films, books, and essays, as a reminder that the most dangerous kind of evil is often born from wounded pride. Hitler's early life, then, isn't just the prologue to a dictator's story, it's a reflection on human nature itself. It reminds us that the smallest wounds, if fed by hatred instead of empathy, can grow into fires capable of burning the entire world. Teenage years. Between 1908 and 1914, Adolf Hitler lived through the most transformative and corrosive years of his life. They were the years that turned him from a failed Austrian artist into a bitter young man consumed by resentment, nationalism, and the seeds of racial hatred. After the death of his mother and 2 failed attempts to enter the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, Hitler's dreams of becoming an artist collapsed. At 19, he was penniless, homeless, and adrift in Vienna, a glittering imperial capital divided by class, race, and ideology. Amid its grand opera houses and crumbling tenements, the foundations of Hitler's worldview began to take shape. Anti-Semitic, anti-Marxist, and obsessed with the idea of German racial superiority. When he first arrived in Vienna, Hitler was still an idealist, enchanted by art and architecture. But Vienna, at the dawn of the 20th century, was no paradise. It was a multi-ethnic empire in turmoil, home to Germans, Jews, Czechs, Hungarians, Slovaks, and countless others, where social tensions and racial nationalism ran deep. To a proud but directionless young man, the city's political chaos became intoxicating. He devoured the fiery rhetoric of Karl Lueger, Vienna's populist mayor, who campaigned under the slogan "Vienna for the Viennese," a thinly veiled attack on Jews and immigrants. He also absorbed the ideas of Georg von Schönerer, who preached pan-Germanism, the belief that only ethnic Germans were fit to rule Europe. From 1909 to 1913, Hitler lived like a drifter in cheap lodgings such as the Meldemannstrasse men's hostel, surviving by selling hand-painted postcards of Vienna's landmarks. He wandered the city, sketching churches and palaces, watching people from park benches, and slowly withdrawing into himself. At times, he managed to make enough to eat well for a few days, but most of the time, he lived in poverty and isolation. To him, Vienna, the city of Mozart and Klimt, became a symbol of moral decay. He saw wealthy Jewish businessmen, liberal politicians, and Marxist intellectuals as proof that the German people were surrounded and betrayed by alien races. Anti-Semitism was nothing new in Vienna, but Hitler absorbed it with unusual intensity. He read Time's Ostara Asterisk, a racist magazine that glorified the Aryan race and warned of Jewish influence. He embraced the pseudo-scientific concept of social Darwinism, the belief that history was a struggle for survival among races, and that the strong had the right to dominate the weak. Living among the poor convinced him that working-class Germans were victims of a corrupt system, controlled by Jews and Slavs. Despite his hardship, Hitler read voraciously. He consumed books on German history, philosophy, and war, especially those that glorified Bismarck and Prussia's military triumphs. He began to see himself as a true German, trapped inside the decaying, multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire. To him, Austria's diversity was its disease, and its cure would come only through unification under a pure, powerful Germany. That belief would become the emotional core of his future ideology. In 1913, Hitler left Vienna for Munich, claiming he no longer wanted to live in a half-Slav country. But there was also a practical reason. He was avoiding military service in Austria. When the authorities caught up with him, he was ordered to return to Linz for a medical exam, where he was declared unfit for service. Back in Munich, he continued to paint and live modestly, clinging to his identity as a German nationalist. Then, in August 1914, everything changed. When World War I broke out, Hitler described in Times, Mein Kampf Times, how he felt reborn. He volunteered for the German army with enthusiasm, seeing war as both salvation and destiny. For the first time, he found discipline, purpose, and a sense of belonging. The trenches of World War I gave him what art in Vienna never could, meaning, but Germany's defeat in 1918 shattered that illusion. The humiliation of Versailles and the stab-in-the-back myth, the idea that Germany was betrayed from within, would ignite his fury and drive him toward politics, vengeance, and power. Historians like Brigitte Hamann and Ian Kershaw describe Vienna and Munich as Hitler's ideological laboratory. It was there, in poverty and isolation, that he learned to see the world not through reason or empathy, but through race and power. The young man who once painted cathedrals now believed that history itself was a battlefield between pure and impure races. From a modern perspective, these years offer a sobering lesson. When personal despair meets social instability, extremism finds fertile ground. A society drowning in inequality and division can easily turn anger into ideology and a lonely man's resentment into a nation's tragedy. The image of Hitler, the failed artist of Vienna, still haunts history books, films, and documentaries today. It reminds us that those who bring catastrophe to the world rarely appear as monsters at first. They often begin as ordinary people wounded, humiliated, and desperate for someone to blame until hatred becomes their only form of expression. WWI experience. The years Adolf Hitler spent in World War I, 1914, 1918, were the most decisive, the turning point that transformed a nameless drifter into a political fanatic. If Vienna planted the seeds of extremism in his mind, then the battlefields of Flanders and Germany's defeat in 1918 watered them until they grew into a fully formed ideology of hatred. Hitler would later admit, "I brought back my experience from the front, and upon it, I built the National Socialist movement." Before the war, Hitler was a struggling painter in Munich, aimless and isolated. When war broke out in July 1914, he was 25, unemployed, friendless, and searching for purpose. But on the 2nd of August 1914, standing among a sea of cheering Germans in Munich's Odeonsplatz, Hitler claimed that all my doubts disappeared. He believed war was his calling, a chance to redeem Germany, and perhaps to redeem himself. Although still legally an Austrian citizen, Hitler saw himself as a true German and volunteered for the Bavarian army, technically an illegal act. For reasons historians still debate, his enlistment was accepted. He was assigned to the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, the List Regiment, and sent straight to the Western Front. His first battle was at Ypres, Belgium, one of the most brutal of the entire war, where hundreds of thousands died in clouds of gas and artillery fire. Hitler survived and was soon made a dispatch runner, a dangerous job that required crossing no man's land to deliver messages under enemy fire. By most accounts, he was brave and disciplined. His officers described him as quiet, obedient, and unusually devoted to duty, a soldier who neither smoked nor drank. His comrades nicknamed him the Monk. He was promoted to Gefreiter, corporal, and awarded the Iron Cross Second Class in 1914, and later the Iron Cross First Class in 1918, a rare honor for a low-ranking soldier. Ironically, the officer who recommended him for that medal was a Jewish lieutenant, Hugo Gutmann, a detail Hitler would later erase from his own legend. For 4 long years, Hitler lived through mud, blood, and chaos. He was wounded twice, once by shell fragments in 1916 and again in October 1918, when he was temporarily blinded by mustard gas. While recovering in the Pacewalk Military Hospital, he received the news that Germany had surrendered and that Kaiser Wilhelm II had abdicated. The moment shattered him. He later wrote that he collapsed completely, burying his face in his blanket and weeping uncontrollably. For Hitler, war had been everything: purpose, brotherhood, and faith. Now, it was gone. But instead of accepting defeat, he began looking for someone to blame. He refused to believe Germany had been beaten militarily. Instead, he embraced a myth that would define his entire ideology: the stab in the back legend, Dolchstoßlegende. According to this conspiracy, Germany didn't lose the war on the battlefield, but was betrayed from within by Jews, communists, and weak-willed democratic politicians. This toxic belief became the emotional core of Nazism: resentment, scapegoating, and the burning desire for revenge. When the war ended, Hitler was a jobless soldier in a shattered nation. Like millions of other veterans, he felt alienated and betrayed. They were called the Lost Generation, men trained for war but unfit for peace. In 1919, still clinging to the army for security, Hitler attended a political education course in Munich. There, officers noticed his talent for fiery oratory. Soon after, he was assigned to spy on a small fringe group, the German Workers' Party, DAP. Instead of reporting on them, Hitler stood up at one of their meetings, delivered an impromptu speech, and mesmerized the audience. Days later, he joined the group himself. Within 2 years, it was renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, and Hitler had become its soul. Almost every element of Hitler's later ideology, extreme nationalism, anti-Semitism, anti-communism, glorification of violence, traced back to World War I. He learned to worship discipline, despise democracy, and equate obedience with strength. War had given his life structure. Defeat had given him a mission. To him, Germany was a sacred victim, and his role was to avenge it. He turned the chaos of the trenches into a kind of political religion, where Germany was the god, traitors were demons, and war was salvation. Once in power, Hitler mythologized his wartime past. He wore the same gray uniform as in 1918, displayed his Iron Crosses proudly, and posed as the soldier of Flanders, a savior rising from the ruins to restore his fallen comrades' honor. In truth, his combat role was limited and far from heroic. Most of his regiment barely remembered him, but propaganda turned the myth into fact. And the legend of Hitler, the heroic soldier, became one of the most powerful narratives in Nazi Germany. Modern historians widely agree that World War I was Hitler's crucible. It forged his worldview: discipline, hatred, and a pathological sense of destiny. As historian Richard Overy put it, without the First World War, there would be no Hitler as we know him. The war didn't just destroy millions of lives, it created the man who would destroy millions more. And perhaps the most haunting lesson of all is this: a war can end with an armistice, but it never truly ends in the minds of those who feel betrayed. Germany's defeat in 1918 didn't just break an empire, it left behind a nation wounded in pride and desperate for meaning. Hitler simply gave that wound a voice, and the fire he lit would soon consume the world.